Well, hello, it's Marcia Sinichar again. A short intro to the last of the very fine interviews by Carolyn Craft of Wisdom Radio. She's a psychologist and a very, very thoughtful person. On this interview, I want to refer you back to something I recorded, I think it was years ago, about 3-4 years ago when I first started the channel. Number 11, way long ago, deals with the topic of forgiveness, which obviously one cannot cover in a few minutes unless we reduce everything down to the trivializing formulas, how-to, quick fix, which I don't want to do. So that's for openers. The second thing I want to say about forgiveness, and by the way, in the number 11, I think towards the end I talk about my own way. It works for me. It cleans out a lot of stuff that we're going to talk about on this upcoming interview. But one thing I want to mention about interviews in general that I have found as I go and tour about books that I've written and so forth and do lectures, invariably the interviewer wants to go back to how do we fix the problem? Then there's a long diatribe about the problem, all the ins and outs of victimization and sadness and the pain and the suffering. Okay, that has its place. However, it doesn't have anything to do with my method. My method begins with God. In the number 11 video or audio, I talk about that term God. It's my preferred term, a triune God, Father, Son, Holy Spirit. You may have other words, but the point is that it's too difficult to talk about victimization, the problem, the suffering, and put our attention on the glory, the light, the possibility of a clean slate, shall we say, of forgiveness. And that's where my positive structuring models come in. It's a principle I work with again and again and again. It essentially says, come from that place that works. And that's what the early awakeners or the spiritually intelligent have to teach us, and you're going to hear me repeating again and again. Thanks for listening. Enjoy.
And we're back. You're listening to Inner Wisdom. I'm Carolyn Craft, and speaking with Marcia Sinichar. She has brought us Do What You Love, the Money Will Follow, and Ordinary People as Monks and Mystics, the Mentor Spirit, and much, much more. Yeah, I'm learning now more about spiritual intelligence. What can we learn from these early awakeners? And we also want to talk about forgiveness, too, and how important it is.
Yeah, well, forgiveness, as I point out, is not something you develop except in the saintly child. You don't develop this full-blown in childhood. This is it's a companion of maturity. It comes through experience and understanding. I think what happens as the spiritual intelligent bloom into adulthood, and this means most of us who are walking around, is that we begin to become the good spiritual parents that I sense we always wanted.
Yeah.
We become that person. And it's in becoming that person that we begin to let go of the old business and affirm our own life. I think I've always made the point that our vocation, or the way we were meant to live and work in the midst of others, our life with others, it heals so much, and it completes a circle. In the scripture we read that the Lord's hands maketh whole. In other words, our own wholeness heals us to the extent that we are able to let go of the old hurt. And we realize that we can't move on until we do that. So it's, in a sense, it's choosing the path of peace because it's the path of life. You see what I mean?
Yeah. I'm thinking in terms, too, of as we learn, as we're growing up and learning about letting it go, letting forgiveness,
Uh-huh.
that there's much more to forgive sometimes than, I don't know. In other words, I find that I've tried to force myself to forgive,
Yeah.
and I'm not sure if I'm really on target with that.
Well, I think sometimes we get very intellectual about forgiveness.
Uh-huh.
We are told that it's so unnatural that we have to force ourselves, or we have a picture of how we are supposed to act.
Something's wrong with me if I'm not forgiving everything and everybody.
That's right. And forgiving, I think it helps, and I try to make this point in spiritual intelligence. If we remember that forgiveness is always here, in other words, you and I have already forgiven everybody for everything they have ever done to us of a negative nature. And we have already forgiven ourselves for everything we've done. It's just living into it. In other words,
Yeah.
Acknowledging that constructive synergy or love at the center of our being.
Someone once told me that forgiveness was giving forth. In other words, letting,
Mm-hmm.
just releasing it, not holding on, not deciding that I've got to always keep my distance from this individual, whatever, just letting it go, not giving it energy.
Not giving it energy. And also the other point I'm trying to make, and I don't think I'm doing justice to the topic of forgiveness in such a short time, because there's more to it than just,
yeah.
A little pat expression. But I don't think it automatically implies fellowship. And that's a point that I've heard a lot from people who have read this book, who say, thank you for that. In other words, the removal of ourselves from an unhealthy situation is completely natural. Jesus of Nazareth, when people were throwing stones at him, he walked away. He slipped into the night and went away with people, the disciples, who understood him.
Mm-hmm.
And I think if we take that as a model, we understand that we're not to be so egotistical that we think that we are already perfected to the extent that we can just sit undisturbed and let people throw stones at us and feel also so peaceful inside. This is the height of ego.
Boy, that's something to breathe into. It really is.
So this goes back to the condemnation that we heap on ourselves that keeps us on this never-ending cycle of repenting and guilt and false guilt and self-blame and blaming others and making ourselves right. If we look, for example, of John Muir, who I've talked about before, where he had such a difficult childhood with I think his father was abusive. He didn't mean to be, but that was the way it was in those days with this particular man. You see, in the old days, let's say, where his father is dying, John is sitting in his bed. We find no bitterness in him. He's even kindly, and he's sort of awakened by the joy of small blessings, little memories of the good times, and that's all. It's not a big deal. It's just letting, as you say, it's just letting it go.
What are some of the other things that we can learn from these early awakeners?
Well, there's just so much. I think that we look at the homes in which they grew up, and we learn something about our own homes, of what we could be doing for ourselves. For example, that the early home life promotes simple human respect. That this, very often I have interviewers and different audience members in the keynote. For example, they ask what to do about children who are rude or people on the street who are rude. And if we just elevate our own simple dignity, our own little respects that we pay each other, the kindnesses. You do this so well. When you introduce a guest, you're so kind to them, and it just sets a stage for such an easy, low pressure, give and take, truthful exchange of ideas. This we can learn from the spiritually intelligent. That there's a kind of easygoing acceptance. This goes back to the live and let live. And I think you see this in artist community.
Mm-hmm.
When I travel very often, I like to stay near an artist community wherever I can, especially when I'm taking road trips, because there's something about walking down the street, seeing people having a little coffee outside, smiling at strangers. You see what I mean?
Yeah.
And we learn this by our observations. So whether we're looking at a Gandhi or we're looking at a Christy Brown or Helen Keller, what you see is a purposefulness. We've talked about that, but you also see a kind of easy acceptance. I think it's because they have accepted who they are in the midst of their differences with other people. They also feel at home.
Marcia, before we do close this segment, I want to make sure we have some time for you to speak to the idea of spiritual intelligence, or the fact of the spiritual intelligence, and that it is going to be so important to us as adults in the future. How so?
Well, I think if you just turn on the news any day this week, whatever week you play our interview on the air, you'll see abrupt changes in the stock market, in global politics, in the way our own politicians respond, the way young people are growing up, job opportunities. There's so much rapid change. There's too much, actually. And so what Alvin Toffler talked about, future shock, we're almost in that now.
Yeah.
And to live in such a way that we are not demanding guarantees and trivializing answers before the fact, or trying to program ourselves for a life we couldn't possibly know what it's going to be like in 20 years. So why are we preparing ourselves for that and losing all this precious time here and now? You see what I mean? So to have more intuition, greater intuition, a kind of vitality, a certain authoritative self-acceptance, the ability to get along with diverse others, all of these attributes that we've talked about this morning, and infinitely more. This is important.
There is, you talk about in the life of creative and spiritual authoritative adults, too, there's an intensity and a constancy of gifts.
Yes.
I'm thinking that that's so vital to our world, our earth, that we get in touch with that so we can greet and meet the next 10 to 20 years without... I mean, I know for me, there was a period of time that I was so out of alignment with, I think, my purpose, that I was depressed and did not want to live. And I'm not saying that for everybody, but I do think that there is that we all need to be able to be in touch with our gifts and what we're bringing to the world, and not just do status quo.
Well, that's right. And I mean, I think if you think of the phrase, I think it's a Buddhist phrase about right action, I would just add that the spiritually intelligent have a kind of spontaneous right action. So they would be able to go with the flow, as that expression goes, because they're tuned in. And here again, I come back to where we began, saying that there's this kind of heightened receptivity to the internal signal. It's an inner music. I remember one writer, I think it was St. John of the Cross, calling it silent music. and this is the spirit within. And it's not something to strive for as much as the receptivity is simply a living from, if you see what I mean.
Yes. Well, the work is Spiritual Intelligence by Marcia Sinatar, what we can learn from the early awakening child. And Marcia, if our listeners can, you have an article now on our Wisdom website. This is a weekly, monthly...
It's a monthly column.
Thanks so much for sharing this hour. As usual, I'm always expanded and enlightened and everything else, and enjoy this time with you.
Well,
Marcia Sinatar.
My great pleasure.
Thank you, too, for joining us on Inner Wisdom.
You're listening to an original production of Wisdom Radio, LLC, copyright 2000, all rights reserved.